Hi and welcome to The Final Whistle. I'm Deepan Raj Ganesan. Today we've got a special episode on The Final Whistle, in the sense where for the first time in our local football series, our guest is not actually with us in the studio, but he'll be joining us virtually. And that's not the only difference. We have got Zaul Raushan joining me on the show as my co-host. If you've been following our Premier League weekly shows, you'd be accustomed to his voice and perhaps his face by now. Hello, Raushan.
Hi, Deepan. Thank you so much for having me. Excited to make my second debut almost for The Final Whistle. And more importantly, I'm so excited for the guests you have lined up today. I'll be honest, I had to do a quick Google search in terms of who the guest is. But once I did that, I realized the guest we have lined up today transcends football. And I think the fact that he played in Singapore for just 1 year, I think the Lion City can take a lot of pride that he spent some time calling Singapore home. And I'm looking forward to speak to him, really.
Yes, definitely. An incredible man who has used his voice for the right reasons. Something like what we are trying to do here on The Final Whistle. Let me introduce him. He's played in the English top flight for Crystal Palace and Portsmouth, but most importantly, from our perspective, he was part of the Malaysia Cup era of the 90s, playing for the Singapore side in 1991. But as Raushan pointed out earlier, the former Australian international has been making a bit of a difference off the pitch since he retired from the game. It's my great pleasure in introducing our guest today, Craig Foster. Craig, how are you doing? How's things in Australia?
I'm very well, thank you. It's a great pleasure to join you. The last time I was in Singapore, well, I did come back a couple of times after I finished playing there, but I had much more black hair than what I have today, and I didn't have a grey beard either. So it's a lot of change in well, we're going back to kind of 1991 or so now. So, over 30 years, incredible to think how quickly that moves on. But I've always retained, of course, half an eye on Singapore. There's been many Australian and some of my friends who've been over there in recent decades, whether coaching or playing. And of course, I have a lot of affection for Singapore and Singaporeans.
Craig, you talk about the change in hair color, but I must say you still look top. You still look good. It's in terms of looking good. Do you remember that 8 days cover, that magazine cover that you were on? What was that all about?
Who talked me into that? I don't know who talked me into that. I don't know how that happened. I still have no idea. But when a story came out recently about the Afghan women's national team and some of the help that, a bunch of people, including me, gave them, they dragged that photo out and that cover out again. It was awful memories, and people were passing it around here in Australia. I pretended that I didn't see it.
For our listeners on Spotify, I urge you to go onto YouTube and check Craig out, because he really looks good with his grey hair, and I'm sure he looked good in that 8 days cover as well. All right, Craig, let's get stuck in. As we do on The Final Whistle, I'm going to rewind the clocks way back to when it all began. How did your journey into football as a career begin? Was it influence from your parents or just watching the game and being inspired?
Well, it was probably neither, actually. My father was a very fine sportsman, but more cricket. I'm from a place in northern New South Wales that's called Lismore here in Australia. It's very close to some of the most beautiful countryside in Australia, around Byron Bay and Lennox Head, and some places that people in Singapore might have visited. And if not, you certainly should do. It's where all of the Matt Damon and all of the Hollywood superstars are spending all the time now. That's my neck of the woods, incredibly beautiful place. But sport has always been a big part of country life, regional life in Australia. And so we just grew up playing everything. In fact, being so regional, I didn't have much football on television. Certainly our local domestic league was on what at that time was a relatively obscure television station called SBS, which I later, when I retired, I ended up spending 20 years there as a broadcaster. Wow. But in those days, we actually didn't get it. So I never saw any of our local football. But what we did have was every Monday night match of the day coming out of England. And BBC. So, as a young kid, like many young players and other football fans in Singapore, the English First Division, as it was then in the kind of early 80s when I was growing as a player, or what you call, of course, the EPL today, was always incredibly popular. So I used to enjoy watching Liverpool. We had Craig Johnston there, the Aussie. I used to particularly enjoy Hoddle and Ardiles around that period with Spurs. And whilst I'm not a lifelong fan of them, I used to wear a Tottenham shirt around, but don't tell Crystal Palace fans that.
I would like just to fast forward the time to the early 90s when you came to Singapore. And of course, before you came here, we had the likes of Abbasad, who was playing here. Alistair Edwards was playing here, I think, the year before you came. Were they influences in you coming here? Were they the ones who talked you into the move here?
Basically, I was really great friends with Alistair. And I actually had moved from Australia from our top league here. I was about to turn 21, so I was still kind of in the formative stages, really. And I was in Germany, actually. I was going to sign for a club over there. And then Alistair, who I've always been very, very close friends with. In fact, only a few years before, when we were 17, we were at the Australian Institute of Sport together down in Canberra, here in Australia, yeah. And so we knew each other really, really well. And he was moving on from that position. He'd had a wonderful time. Of course, he'd had some success with the Singapore team and making the final, I think, that year, right? And he was moving over to Johor, I think, and he recommended that I and others, including Warren Spink, of course, who was already a Socceroo, was international at that time, come over and have a look at it. And I found Singapore to my great liking. I loved the place. Having spent little time really in Asia and Southeast Asia up until that time, I found it absolutely fascinating. And I thought, well, this would be an interesting time in football to spend a little bit of time here.
Well, you only spent about a year in Singapore, but you talk about liking the city a lot. Do you look back on your time in Singapore with a lot of affection? Are there any particular stories or memories you may have over your year here?
I just met many wonderful people. I enjoyed the metropolitan and kind of international life and makeup of the city. And, with just people coming out of the country, really, I'd pretty much been up in regional country of New South Wales, Australia, and then in Canberra, which now is much bigger, but then was like really a large regional town. And having travelled a little bit with junior teams and so on was okay. But Singapore was really my first taste of a globalised, international, multicultural city where, everyone that I was meeting, football fans or otherwise, were from all corners of the world. And, of course, the local culture was so rich, diverse and beautiful, and was also something new for me. So, whether it was the hawker markets and eating local food, or going down to Little India or meeting, so many local people, including the players, of course, I just found it incredibly rich and I guess mind-opening. It was at that time of my life was a very important step in terms of understanding Asia, understanding other cultures, being able to integrate and work with other people. And of course, today, I work largely in multiculturalism and sit on the Australian Multicultural Council with our federal government. So it was just one step along that way.
In terms of playing in Singapore, of course, you played at the National Stadium, the old National Stadium. How was the crowd like at that time? I mean, we don't have it right now in terms of the crowds, but how was that feeling like playing in Singapore?
Well, of course, I came to understand the Lions roar and, the National Stadium was marvellous. I didn't know prior to that. Essentially what was happening in those times was, young players like myself, had ambitions to do two things: to play at the top level in Europe and to play for our national team, the Socceroos, rightly, as you'd understand. But just around that time, because our domestic competition was only about 6-7 months of the year, what was happening just a couple of years prior, you had the great Alan Davidson going to Selangor, and then you had Alistair and Abbas going across to Singapore. And all of a sudden, all of these Southeast Asian leagues started to look at the players here. And the attraction from our perspective was that they weren't lengthy leagues. And it was providing us all an opportunity to go and play in Southeast Asia for kind of half a year or so. And most people would come back and then play here in Australia again. So particularly for young players or those who, no longer had ambition of playing in Europe, it kind of made the season, full professional, year round, and it provided us. Some of us provided a platform to then grow as professionals and go later on to Europe, or people like Warren Spink and others. Just allowed them to, if you like, in their mind, be fully professional. So that was wonderful. And I knew very little about it. I hadn't played. We'd been in Oceania prior to that. Even at that time, in terms of our confederation, and that meant in the under-17 national team of Australia and the junior national teams I was in, we didn't play against Asian teams. That didn't happen till 2006 or so. 2005, 05, 06. So, we had very little experience there. And then so I turned up at this national stadium and there's like 65,000 people there. And it was this incredible passion. Of course, Alistair had told me about that. He'd played in it the year before. But that was his big, he was saying, listen, this is extraordinary passion in Singapore for football. You're not going to believe what you're seeing here. People just absolutely love the game. They've got huge following of the national team. Of course, that's the difference as well. In those years, it was the national team playing together with 3 foreigners in the Malaysian semi-pro. And so we were kind of guests playing in your national team, which was fabulous. So there was this great outpouring of passion around your FAS team. And to go there, every second week and play in front of 65,000 people in what was a wonderful stadium. It was a tremendous experience.
I think when we talk about the national stadium, there's a bit of nostalgia for all of us. You having played there as well as Deepan and me, who were youngsters, young boys really, watching football in the old national stadium, which we miss very much. Craig, you mentioned there playing alongside some of the players, and I'm just going to give you a list of some of these names who are household names really in Singapore. Terry Patmanaban, Nasir, Lim Tong Hai, David Lee, some names who really are the fabric of Singapore football, right? Do you have any memories with these players?
Well, I have a lot of memories. I remember the players themselves. I remember we used to train a lot at Jalan Besar Stadium, as you guys all know. And so, I remember, the personalities of all of them, the like Hasnim Haron, the Singaporean Malay group. And then you had, the Singaporean Chinese group of players, Lim Tong Hai and others, and Nazri Nazir, who was a fantastic young talent coming through, and Hasnim, who was just a brilliant dribbler of the ball. I remember well, and he had a fantastic shot from distance. So it was a really good generation, David Lee in goal. Of course, Terry then, was a wonderful player at the back, very skilled on the ball, very calm. And they were marvellous players. It came not too long after, your perhaps one of your greatest players, if not the greatest, Fundy, had played across in Holland even. And so all of these things I was learning about Singaporean football when I was there. But what I wasn't surprised about, but I came to know very quickly, was that, you had some fantastic players, fantastic talent. For whatever reason, the vast majority of them never tested themselves in Europe. But you see many players from Southeast Asia, of course, now excelling in leagues all around Asia, including Australia. And, many of that team could have done likewise.
Yep, definitely. Let's talk about things off the pitch at that time in Singapore, where in the early 90s, we saw match fixing being a problem in Singapore football and Asian football, rather. Did you have any instances where you saw it firsthand?
Not really. No, I came out of Australia, so I was very ignorant, actually.
Okay.
I was very naive. I didn't even realise that it existed, to be quite honest. And then I started to read about it and hear about it a little bit in Singapore. But I had no direct experience of it with other players, or the only time that it ever crossed my my purview, if you like, was when I remember I was out once after the game one night in Orchard Road there, and someone came up to me, I don't know who it was, and asked me for information about the team in the following week or perhaps, even later, look, can you, I'm such and such, and I was kind of in this environment with my friends and others and some of the players, and I met this person and, no worries, nice to meet you. And anyway, talking away, and all of a sudden they said something like, oh, listen, so anyway, would you mind, if I give you my number, you can tell me what the team is before games in future. And I remember, and this was quite early in my being there, and I remember saying, well, what do you mean? What are you talking about? And they said, well, all we need to know is who the team is, and I said, well, no, that's not right because, firstly, I don't know what the team is. And secondly, I wouldn't give it to you. I'm not going to anyone else. Why would I do that? And then, of course, I mentioned this to a couple of other, this is how naive I was as a young person. And I mentioned it to another couple of people and I said, well, listen, that's, those people are renowned as, match fixing, all these things are here. And so I reported it to people at FAS immediately. And I was approached by this person, here's the number and blah, blah, blah. And I didn't hear anything about it post. But, it subsequently in years after that, it became, a huge issue there.
Yep, definitely a huge issue. I want to talk something a bit more lighthearted. In terms of, you talked about hawker food, right? Right now, at this moment, is there a particular dish here in Singapore that you still remember, you still feel like you could taste it?
Oh, yeah, look, it really sparked my taste for all sorts of Asian food. But the chicken satays, actually, I'm vegetarian now.
Ah, okay.
Oh, wow.
My age now, so I would probably struggle. But actually, I'm pescatarian, so I'd be all right.
Okay.
I remember particularly well the satay sticks, and that incredible peanut sauce, peanut that they used to put on top of it, quite amazing on those, foam plates, and they would just pull it straight off the grill, straight down there,
I tell you what, it's about lunchtime here in Singapore now, and you've got me really hungry.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm here drooling. I'm like, okay, I don't know if Craig has had lunch, but I'm hungry at the moment.
Yeah, I also remember particularly the seafood, and because I do eat seafood now, and the flat fish, the sole, they would put this in the middle and they would slap it like that, with the head off, and they would just put it on and
ikan bakar, I think they call it in Malay. It's called ikan bakar, which literally means burnt fish. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. so good. I used to love to go down there and. And people, and it was so social, people just love it, in the middle of the night, late at night, just in a pair of shorts, of course, it was very warm, sitting around having this marvelous food and with friends. And that part of Singaporean culture, I've never forgotten. It's wonderful.
Craig, sorry, I just have to ask on the topic of food. You mentioned becoming pescatarian more recently. Is that a health-related choice, or is that just something you've decided to do with age?
Well, it's a couple of things. One is health related. Yes, I had a few friends, including colleagues who I worked on air with in Australia here. As you guys know, I spent 20 years with our multicultural broadcast called SBS, working on World Cups and Champions Leagues, and at one point EPL and even our domestic leagues. And I had several colleagues who died from cancer, and some of the advice to them was around their red meat in their diet, which kind of piqued my interest, and I started to research it a little bit. And once I decided that I think it's more healthy on a plant-based diet, then I also came to understand the impact on the planet of agriculture, in particular of meat production. Whether it's in terms of emissions or the destruction of habitats and forests worldwide. So, those two things together just seem to me like an obvious choice. And since I've felt great, not to demean your hawkers who make your make your satays, but it's been wonderful for me the last probably almost 10 years now.
We'll save you some ikan bakar, but we'll have the chicken satay, I'm sure. Deepan and I will take care of that. Right. Let's just bring back to...
Who's buying?
Ideally you.
That's what I thought.
Let's just bring it back to football now. And you had the pleasure of representing the Socceroos, Australia, earning almost 30 caps for your national team. And of course, one of the happier moments was in 1997 in the Confederations Cup. I think Australia finished runners-up. What were those times like? Because for the Singapore listeners, there were so many household names in that team as well. Aurelio Vidmar, who used to coach at the Lion City Sailors, Ernie Tapai, as well as Harry Kewell, Mark Viduka, all these popular names. What was it like being in that team?
Well, it was great. Sadly, we didn't qualify for the World Cup because we drew against Iran in a big game in 1997, which was a really chaotic, crazy night down at the MCG in Melbourne, in front of 85,000 fans, which was a record crowd at that time. So that was quite sad because we had a team that we thought could really do something in the 1998 World Cup in France. 100%. One of the reasons is because it was one of the best generations Australia's ever had. We had also Paul Ocon, who'd been the player of the year in Belgium and also was playing for Lazio. We had Ned Zelic, who'd played with Dortmund. I think he made a UEFA Cup final and was an outstanding player. We had Robbie Slater, who was with Southampton and had won an EPL with Blackburn, and we had Stan Lazaridis, who was well known as at West Ham, and
I think Bosnich was the keeper. No,
Bozza was in goal.
Oh yes, yeah.
In goal. Yeah, Bozza from Aston Villa, Man United, Chelsea. Perhaps our best ever keeper, phenomenal, and we had some good ones. Spider Kalach and is a good friend of mine, and Mark Schwarzer. But
Mark Schwarzer as well.
Bozza was amazing, and the other two were basically his number two at that time, and. It was a really phenomenal to Craig Moore, who had a lot of experience playing with Rangers and winning many titles up in Scotland. But sadly we messed it up. But then we went to we messed up the qualification, and then only a month later, though, we had opportunity to play in Saudi Arabia, as it happens, in the first ever Confederations Cup, and in that Confed Cup, the team showed what they were capable of, particularly under Venables, who was a very fine coach. Tactically very astute. And so we beat Mexico, I think 3-1 or something. We beat Uruguay.
Wow.
And we drew with Brazil and ultimately lost to Brazil in the final. So the team demonstrated what it was capable of. A Confed Cup is not a World Cup. Everyone acknowledges that. However, the teams we were playing against were at their peak. That was it was a great generation, a very strong period for Mexico. Uruguay were extremely strong at that time. And of course, Brazil, were unbelievable. They went to the final in France. So, had we made it, we thought we could do something. But look, playing for that was very rewarding, playing for the internationals. I must say, moving across to Asia, when I was young, I was in our junior national teams, and then I had some injuries, which is very common for everyone, but all of us have to fight back from that and find a way to get back to our best. And I was still in that period. And what Singapore, and later I went to Hong Kong for a couple of years as well. What playing in Southeast Asia it did for me was enabled me to just rebuild my confidence, rebuild my play, rebuild my career, really. And a couple of years later, then I came back to Australia. I settled in Adelaide with the champions at the time, played for them, made the national team, and that was by the time I was 26. And then I played from basically 26 to 30, 31. So I was quite late in making the national team because of, the injuries that I've had when I was young. But I always recall very fondly, playing across in Asia, and it was a very important period for me to recover my, the best that I was able to give.
I hope I've got my knowledge of history correct here, but I remember in that Confederations Cup, the Brazil team had the likes of Ronaldo and Romario leading the line. You were, of course, able to watch them up close. How good was the Brazil team, and how much did you learn just by watching them?
Well, look, firstly, they were incredibly scared coming up against Foster Muscat and Paducah. Look, they were very, very, very good. So that generation of Brazil that played in the 98 World Cup final, they lost to France. Zizou, of course, scored a couple of goals at home. And Ronaldo didn't play in the final, as was famously known, right? We still don't know what happened. But the team itself was an unbelievable team. And to see them up close was a highlight, really. The final wasn't, because we drew with them 0-0 in the group stage. And it was the first time they'd gone scoreless, I think, for something like 3, 4, 5 years. And they were really, really upset. Right. Yeah. And the press in Brazil was getting stuck into them. How can you have a 0-0 with Australia? Who's Australia? And so by the time we come to the final, we had to face them again. And Mark Viduka, brilliant player and very good person. Dukes got himself sent off. And so sadly, we had 10 men against a very, very pissed off Brazil team. and one of the best generations of Brazil, maybe ever. So their front three was the three R's, Ronaldo, El Fenomeno, Rivaldo, and Romario.
Yeah.
Okay. So individually, each one of those in a team is already unbelievable. That was around the time when Rivaldo was at Barca and Romario, that's been at Barcelona, right? For good reason. So three of their most historic players playing together. And then who were the fullbacks? Who do you reckon the fullbacks were? So the Cafu and Roberto Carlos.
Roberto Carlos, yeah.
And then they had as well on the left wing, Danielson, who at that time was the most expensive player in the world. He went for 23 million, I think it was 23 million pounds to Real Betis.
Yeah. I remember him with the green.
This guy had stepovers on stepovers. This guy would go one, like you normally go 1, 2, 3. This guy would go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. People going, what are you doing? And then mate, this guy was crazy. And I remember a moment in the game, I was playing on the right-hand side and so I was facing up. We're about to kick off and I look up, and behind me I got Kevin Muscat, who, was a very celebrated player for Australia, played for Wolves in the UK and Crystal Palace, my old club, and was the only, I think might have been the first one to captain Australia at all levels, 17s, 23s. And he was playing right back, I was playing right midfield. And I looked up, we're about to kick off, and in front of us was Danielson and Roberto Carlos. And just over there was Ronaldo, and I turned to him and said, I said, Kev, you're going to have a really good game today, bro.
Did he say the same thing to you?
This is not going to be fun, right? And we were just, we were mucking around, but I also remember coming out, and the first time we played them, we came out into the tunnel to play, and we're just standing there as an Australian team ready, come out in the King Fahd Stadium in Saudi, and we're going to play this big game. And where's Brazil? They're nowhere to be seen. Anyway, we're waiting a minute. Next thing we just hear singing, and a bit of drum. And they're just, turn around, we're going, what are you doing? We've got an international play. Anyway, they're just dancing. They come, they're linked hands. Someone's got a drum and they did, and I turned to one of the guys and said, listen, we could be in trouble here. If that's how happy and confident these people are, we're going to have to see how we go. Anyway, they were just unbelievable. They had Juninho Pernambucano, the only guy who couldn't play, and they needed him just to hold the whole team together. Yeah. Otherwise, it was just like too many stars. It was Dunga in the centre. Mm-hmm. Aside from that, everyone else was like, I think that Junior Baiano at the back, and everyone else was, except for the two central defenders and Dunga, they had like this three at the back, like this. Yeah. And then everyone else was just like crazy talented. And after the final, we played 10 men against them and we conceded a few. It was horrible. And we couldn't touch the ball. I mean, against 11 men, that's difficult, but against 10, it's just not. And what happened is, and also at that time, we weren't a team, we were playing a system, I might have been playing 3-5-2. We were playing a style of football where we were really expansive, wanted to keep the ball and go. Mm-hmm. And that Australian team at that time was not going to just say, oh, look, let's just close everything up, and just sit here and have none of the ball. We were still going to try and play, which gave them an opportunity to break us down. In some ways it was a bit brave, if not a bit stupid. And and I remember after the game where, we've finished, thank God, it was like, that someone finally blew the whistle and we were kind of strolling off. And one of my teammates, very clever guy, actually, very smart guy, he walked past me and he said, oh, geez, Foz, he said, mate, they're playing a different game. And I looked at him and I said, you know what, that's exactly right, actually. That is exactly right. They are playing a different game. They actually were playing a different game to us. They had, their dexterity, their skill, their speed of thought, all coming out of futsal. You're talking about a level of players here of the top 50 players ever, incredible footballers. They were playing a completely different game to us. And it was in some ways was a good moment for me because I ended up in broadcasting and talking a lot about Australia and where we're going and how we might play and what strengths we have. And that informed some of my thinking because I'd seen up close really what people are capable of when playing football. Mm. And I of course recognise that Australia still remains today a long way off, and that's where we want to be as a really very enthusiastic, powerful, often sporting nation.
Craig, I think it's a wonderful way to end off the football side of things, but we can't have you on the show and not talk about your efforts off the pitch since you've retired. You are, of course, a human rights activist these days. You led a global effort that included lobbying FIFA to secure the release of Bahraini footballer Hakim Al-Araibi from Thailand. He was, of course, wrongfully arrested in 2018. Hakim, of course, was eventually freed and he's an Australian citizen these days. This desire to make a difference, where does it come from? How strong are you as involved in these things these days?
Well, I'm equally as involved off the field in social justice causes as I am in the game, whether broadcasting or otherwise. In the last couple of years, probably more so. I've spent more time helping people and using my profile to try to do that. And my government contacts, I sit on, in recent years, various government bodies within Australia and from time to time, I have the opportunity to work with the Australian government on issues such as Hakim, where it was important to work with our foreign ministry and our ambassador and our embassy in Bangkok. And we were very successful there in, thankfully, getting him out. Otherwise, we're not sure where he would have ended, if he'd been extradited improperly back to Bahrain. Well, who knows what would have happened to him. So today he's happy. He has a son who's almost a year old now, and he has a new house down in Melbourne, a new job. He's rebuilding his career and trying to rebuild his life off the field as well. That was very nice. Today, I work in refugee advocacy, Indigenous rights here in Australia, but just many issues that I feel go to the heart of either the essence of where Australia is and where we should go, where it is that we're not living up to the standards I think we should be, or indeed quite often our image of ourselves as a nation, and our treatment of asylum seekers and refugees is patently one of those. Indigenous rights, climate action through sport, a whole range of causes. Given that I have, through football and broadcasting, been able to just develop a network of people in Australia of influence and, if you like, power in different ways, and also that I'm able to, through various channels, speak to Australians, whether through broadcasting or social media or otherwise, then, I've tried in recent years in particular to use that for good. And I think it's an area where sport has to be involved. I think we can do much better. Certainly footballers can do much, much, much better. We see what's happening with basketballers, the WNBA, the NBA, with some NFL players, with Naomi Osaka, tennis, following on from Billie Jean King so many decades ago in the late 60s. There's so many examples, but we don't see too many in football. That's why Marcus Rashford is so important. What he did around poverty and access to food for impoverished children in England or UK in particular. So it's critically important. Football clubs and footballers tend to steer away from really critically important social issues globally. And I'm not totally sure why that is. I mean, look, for instance, at Lionel Messi, Cristiano Ronaldo, or any of the other top players, the biggest football brands, individuals in the world, and you don't see a lot of advocacy, a lot of commentary, a lot of support you don't see much for climate action, firstly, something that faces the whole world. You don't see much for even racial equality unless it is that they take a knee with the rest of their team. Football really lags behind many other sports globally in this aspect. And I think we need to become much, much, much better. So today I try and do what I can, but I also spend quite a bit of time speaking to current players unions and others, and helping them understand how to advocate socially in the safest way possible that won't affect their contract, won't put their career at risk, and talking to them about the risks and rewards of getting involved in issues that they feel strongly about. In fact, just in the next month or so, we'll be releasing a course here in Australia on sport and social justice. So I'm an adjunct professor with Torrens University in Australia.
Nice.
And so we have a course coming out, which is a short online free course, and that's for everyone in sport, about what sports are doing well in this regard. AS Roma is a great example. AS Roma, for example.
When they announced their transfers?
With their transfers, when they were signing a player, they also were then talking about a child who had disappeared.
Yep.
And so they've tried to find innovative ways to amplify really important social justice issues. And they've taken some risk, reputational risk in that regard, whilst doing it, which is important. People want to see authenticity, which means it's no good just being safe. It's no good just saying, we support this thing over here, but only in the way that doesn't put us at any risk. And no, what they're saying is, look, we think this is important, and we're going to talk about this irrespective if that's upset some of our fans who think that we shouldn't be in this space. And I think that's really important. So AS Roma is a good example, but, we've got Forest Green Rovers in climate, in England and others. But, I'd certainly like to see more examples.
You talked about Marcus Rashford. I think, like you said, it's a rarity, right? I think we've got Juan Mata doing his Common Goal project as well. Yeah. That's quite similar. But you talked about you are not quite sure why that's the case, where footballers don't do more. But how can they do more? Like, for example, I'm quite sure some Singaporean footballers will be watching this. Some Australian footballers will be watching this. What is the start point? What can they do?
Well, firstly, find what it is that you feel strongly about. And, don't join causes that just because they're popular or just because you think that you're expected to say something. Find something that's authentic, that's purpose-led, that you can say, look, I feel extremely strongly about this. The best place to start is human rights. One of the issues that athletes have is they tend to not be as because they require an absolute narrow focus on their craft. Yeah. Because of the difficulty, the complexities, and the pressures that come with it. They tend not to be. In fact, people around them tend to discourage education, interest, and involvement in things that are non-football, and or even sport. And therefore, I think that's wrong. Where ultimately the climate change is the greatest example. It's like, well, okay, it's fair enough. You can score 100 goals, but if the planet's burning and half of Australia's bushfires, like, what is the point? So, it's really it's what you're doing through expressing your love and your passion for your sport, and through your skills and your determination, your excellence and your persistence and your resilience, is you're creating something through your art, through your work, that provides an opportunity to help others, including the planet, for example, right? And I use climate action as a prime example because it's just a great example of saying, well, what sport's doing is just saying, look, we're doing over here, and we don't really want to speak about all this stuff. And then, the kind of image of the planet burning around them is a very stark one. And so sport is increasingly both waking up to the need to interact in broader social issues, and secondly, fans, sponsors, and other stakeholders are basically saying, well, we need to know where you stand on this. Like if I'm a Lionel Messi fan, then there's many people now saying, well, listen, I need to know, like I think given your platform, and what sport has also provided you through your brilliance, you should be trying to help some of these things. Perhaps it's not enough for any of us anymore just to be a very narrow focused, career-minded, and just be a great accountant, a great footballer, a great podcaster. Yeah. We're all human beings. So rather than athletes, today I call them sporting citizens, because what I'm saying is we're all citizens first, and we're all global citizens first, I hope, right? And so I'm a global citizen before I am an Australian. We're all human beings. And that means that I need to support other people, that I need to understand the world around me, that I need to engage in issues that are of importance to all of us. Otherwise, if one section of society, which happens to be sport, stays out of all of these important issues, then we're essentially abrogating our responsibility as humans and putting the additional load on other areas. Okay, so academics are speaking out, or the NGOs, charities, and individual citizens, and sometimes business gets together and does something. Well, where the hell is sport? So people are, I think, increasingly expecting this. BLM was really important. So what happened with the NFL, Kaepernick, and LeBron James, and WNBA players incredibly strong. They said, we're not playing tomorrow. We're not playing. We think that, racial equality and the mistreatment and injustice perpetrated on Black or African Americans or people of color and Black Americans is much more important than us scoring baskets tomorrow. And I happen to agree with them. And then what happens is some fans say, well, oh, yeah, but I don't want to think about those things. I just want to think about, bouncing a basketball and seeing it. And then what I say is, well, hang on, we're not monkeys. Okay, I'm not a monkey. And therefore, Lionel Messi is not a monkey. Nothing against monkeys, but, for the animal activists. But, Lionel Messi is a professional and a human being. And just because he can score goals doesn't mean that he has to do it for you, me, or anyone else and shut his mouth as a human being. If Lionel Messi came out tomorrow and said, well, listen, I feel really strongly about Amazon rainforests, and I reckon that, Bolsonaro shouldn't be cutting them all down, and destroying, the lungs of the world and blah, blah, blah. Some of his fans and some PSG fans would say, oh, well, geez, he shouldn't be doing that. Whereas I would be saying, geez, it's about time. Okay? It's about time. But the reason I talk about human rights is because we're talking about a very specific set of things that we need to advocate for here. Yeah. Because every religion is different. People have different views. And, many of those can be contentious, and that's perfectly fine because that's human life, that's human nature, that's human complexity. But human rights are a set of objective standards that we can all say, listen, I believe in racial equality. I believe in, anti-racism. I believe in gender equality. I believe in the right to freedom of association, these things. And anyone in sport who steps forward and argues for those, rather than just, what education for children, or anti-poverty, these things which are very safe, seen as very safe. A livable planet is certainly a human right. Anyone in sport who steps forward and stays within that space, I think is not only right, but has not just a right to do so, but a duty actually.
Craig, your passion shines right through when you're talking about these things. I do hope that the listeners will listen to what you're saying and really come forward in helping out the fellow citizens, like you said, global citizens. Raushan, I believe you got one more question before we move on to rapid fire.
Yes, I do. Craig, you speak so much about activism and using your influence. Most recently, you and a group made up of former athletes have managed to help evacuate more than 100 Afghan female athletes, their family members and officials, along with 100 more ordinary Afghanis, as Taliban took over control of the country, right? Tell us more about how this took place and why you felt that burning desire that you had to do something about the situation.
Firstly, I try to do what I can when I'm in situations where within my context, that means either with the skills that I have or the contacts and network that I have, where I can help people whose human rights in particular are being breached. Hakeem Al-Arabi, the young kid, was one example of that. This was just another example where the Taliban were taking over, particularly women athletes were at extreme, urgent, immediate risk because, as you've seen subsequently, the Taliban have now said that women shouldn't be playing sport, firstly. And secondly,
Crazy.
having been high-profile female sports women or female athletes, put them at risk of retribution. And so, therefore, they needed help. And simply what happened is there's a couple of ex-athletes, women who are lawyers and refugee and immigration lawyers here in Australia who contacted me. And they'd been contacted by people abroad who knew the Afghan women's national team, had been working with them several years. You guys would know probably that they had a sexual abuse case against some Afghan football officials that ultimately FIFPro, the global athletes body, and a range of advocates around them ended up helping the players. And FIFA were very slow to act there, but ultimately they were forced to do so. And so therefore there'd been this group around the players working with them anyway for several years. And then when the Taliban issue started and Australia was starting to pull out evacuation flights along with the UK and Canada and others, then the question was raised, can we get these women out? And if so, where to? So I jumped on a call. These guys contacted me here. I jumped on a call with the Centre for Sport and Rights, who I know. Most of this community I had worked with in some capacity during the Hakeem Al Arabi case. And I jumped on a Zoom call with the Centre for Sport and Rights in Geneva, which is basically it is a centre which is tasked with upholding human rights in sport. And they were saying, look, we've got athletes. There's more athletes that we're sure would get out, and we need somewhere for them to go. And they had a number of governments on that call, and they had me, and I said, look, I think that I'm going to advocate. Hopefully, we can bring them to Australia. So I recruited a couple of people here, really good friends of mine. One is two of those athletes were Paralympians, by the way, Azaki and Hossein, who ended up. We got them out, and only a week later, they ended up competing in the Tokyo Paralympics.
That's beautiful. And
then there were the Afghan women's football team, and then many other athletes from a whole range of sports, taekwondo and cricket and others. And so I contacted one of our Paralympic legends here. His name's Kurt Fernley. He's a fantastic guy. He's a very good human and a legendary Paralympian. And asked him to advocate to our sports minister. And I contacted our first ever Winter Olympian, who is an independent MP. So basically, these guys needed the Australian government to accept them and say they're going to give them visas. So I said, I'll help in that respect. So basically, I advocated to our government. I brought on board some good friends to help. And I spent the next, in fact, it's still ongoing now. There's many, many people at risk. But essentially, I worked with the groups who were close to the athletes and the Australian government, particularly our Immigration Minister, Alex Hawke, and our Foreign Minister, Maurice Payne, who's a fabulous person. And I've worked with a number of times now, including with Hakeem. And so we were able to get our government to very quickly commit to giving visas to these women. And because of that, we could tell the other guys, get them to the airport immediately, and we'll work to get them on the evacuation flights. And so they just started getting athletes, by the dozen to the airport in Kabul. We knew that there were some security risks and our time window was very tight. And so therefore, and then when they were getting to the airport, they had people inside the airport. They're working with the helping as well. And I also were feeding everything to our ministers, in particular our foreign minister, particularly the Paralympians and the football women. And so I was in constant contact with our ministers to say, look, we need to get these people in. And so we worked together to make that happen. So subsequently, we were able to assist with visas for a vast number of people, not just athletes, but actually young girls at risk, and many, many people have gotten out prior to the flight evacuations and also post. So it's been reasonably stressful sort of time for everyone involved, very fraught, people's lives actually genuinely at risk, and it's pretty horrible, actually, absolutely horrible. But, it had to be done. It does demonstrate, again, the power of sport because, sports people within Australia, were able to, whether it's right or wrong, sport does provide a certain amplification of issues, and it does provide a network and access to be able to pick up the phone to people at the top level, wherever we are in the world, whether that's the governing bodies or governments. And the only issue is if we do have that access, then it's imperative that we use it to help other people and not use it to help ourselves. Right?
Exactly.
So that's what we can do. We can use that access to, build our own career and end up living on 25 yachts, or we can use it to, try and just help people when they're in trouble. Unfortunately, today in the world as it is, increasingly there's, more and more people at trouble in a lot of ways. So, once you get into this area, it is, in some ways it's never ending, but it's necessary. So what I do now, guys, is I've gone back to broadcasting recently with a streaming platform called Stan here in Australia, and we have the Champions League rights. And I haven't done that for probably 18 months or so. I stopped my other broadcasting and probably needed a bit of a break to refresh after 18 years, but also I had all of this, social work to do with refugees and others. And so now it's been very nice to go back. It's part of the Nine network in Australia. It's the biggest broadcasting network in the country. And to go back, we had match day 1 last week, of course, which was we had Liverpool-Milan. Imagine what a fantastic game.
What a game it was as well.
What a game. So, and at age of 52 now and having done all these things, to go back to broadcasting, it's not full-time, but just on Champions League, so every few weeks, it was really beautiful.
Quick question though, I struggle to wake up at 3 a.m. in Singapore to watch the game. How are you staying up at 5 a.m. to watch the games?
Well, I did it for 20 years, so it's kind of fair. And plus I just get so excited about the games, that most times I can't sleep, so it's the opposite. But it's just been quite beautiful because when I retired, I was 32 and I went straight into broadcasting World Cups. And, and it was very exciting and, and it was a wonderful place to be and, travel the world, Brazil and Cape Town and Moscow, Red Square and everywhere for World Cups and so on. But I come back to the game now with a different kind of appreciation. It's almost like my happy space. I know the power of what it can do. Yeah. But I also can just go there and just enjoy the game in a very pure way. And the rest of my time is spent in what is often very dark issues with people like the refugees that Australia's been mistreating, like people who've got severe mental health problems after 8 years. Many of them have tried to take their own life. They haven't seen their families. And, you're talking about really serious trauma. Yeah. And sport doesn't prepare you well for that. But now, I've just kind of reestablished a very nice balance. And so football, I understand what it can achieve, but I'm also able to just come to it with a pure heart, if you like.
Craig, I'm sure
the world needs more Craig Fosters for sure.
Of course. I was just going to say, I think you've heard the word thank you so much, but thank you for standing for so much more than just football. It is the beautiful game, but the power of the beautiful game is really amplified by people like you.
Yeah, for sure. Craig, we have come to the end of the interview, but before you go, you've got to get through one last thing, which is the rapid fire round. 5 questions that will require an immediate answer to. I'll start off by asking you the first question. Who is the best player that you played with while in Singapore?
I'd say probably Hasnim. Hasnim Haron was a brilliant player who could perform on any pitch, anywhere. Like some of the pitches we played up in Malaysia. I mean,
it's still the same in Tua Payoh if you check it out.
In some of those fields, it was like, what are you doing? How are we supposed to play football on this thing, right? And no disrespect to them, but this is going back to the early 90s. And Hasnim Haron, it didn't matter. He just had beautiful technique. He was a very, very talented footballer, and I always remember the skills that he had.
All right, second question. Who is the best player you have ever faced in your career?
It's that Brazil team had a lot of them. But if I had to say one of that team, to see them close up and the ability they had was probably Ronaldo, El Fenomeno. We faced him twice. He scored a hat-trick in the final, sadly. But I saw him, near his peak. It was, you can watch YouTube all you want. And I encourage everyone, because this is the old Ronaldo, not the current one. And people forget very quickly in football. Listen, he was unbelievable.
All right, moving on to the next one. I think you might enjoy this one. If you could be the FIFA president for one day, what would you change or introduce?
I would bring in a robust ethics panel, because the first thing Infantino did when he took over was sack the president of the, or the head of the ethics panel, right? His name was Justice Eckert, okay? And that's typical for football. Is like, we're going to do all the right thing, everything's fine, but we certainly don't want anyone really having a look at us, scrutinising too closely. Right? So I would like to think that I would do that, because that's the best way to ultimately clean up the sport and keep it accountable. Okay, you've got to have independent oversight, and the sport has never had it. Because look what happened with Bladder and so on. The only reason that ultimately that house of cards came down was because of FBI.
Yeah.
Okay, you needed always, that's actual independent law enforcement. The game has never been able to enforce its own law, ever.
Yeah.
And it's about time that it does.
All right, moving on to something a bit lighthearted. Warren Spink, Abbasat, Alistair Edwards, and yourself. Who was the best Australian to have played for the Singapore Lions?
You'd have to ask your fans that. It depends how you measure it, in terms of overall careers or what. But, all my credit to Alistair and Abbas, what they did with the team was amazing. They had a fabulous year, and they both really revelled in playing in Singapore. They loved it. They both ended up, having families, and of course, Alistair still is with Johor, the Johor club, and they've won multiple championships, and he's continuing to, add his brilliance and his technical knowledge to Malay football today. So they both made a huge impact, so I give them immense credit.
And of course, Abbas is still involved in Singapore football. He recently came back to Singapore, and he's part of the technical team at Geylang International, one of the clubs here in Singapore. So we wish him the best.
Abbas was a hugely talented player, who could have done much. See, Alistair had a very strong career with our junior national team. Then he went there, and then he also played for our senior national team. I'm not sure how many caps, but he was a fantastic contributor and a brilliant technical mind as well. He was our technical director at one point. Whereas Abbas, really had. He won a title with Alistair, and that's where Singapore saw them, I think, in that 89 grand final that they won over here in Sydney with Sydney Olympic. And he had a magnificent career there in Southeast Asia. Abbas could have done much more. I mean, Alistair went and played, with Rangers in Scotland, and he played with Millwall and so on. Abbas could have easily done that as well. He was a phenomenal talent, as Singapore fans know. But probably Singapore fans saw the best of Abbas, the best of Abbas's career, whereas I think with the others, they didn't, because Alistair was in Europe and the national team, and so was I, and Warren Spink was, was a brilliant long-term contributor here in Australia, and only for a short period there. But so I think the Singapore and perhaps Malay fans as well, with Johor and whatever, saw the best of Abbas's career. Absolutely phenomenal player. And then he came back here and he won a title as a coach. In his first year with his old club, Sydney Olympic. So just a brilliant football mind, both of them. So Abbas and Alistair, I know they are, but they should be really, very famous names within Southeast Asian football. And we're here in Australia, we're very proud of both of them, as we are Alan Davidson and others, people who've made a huge contribution.
For sure. And my final question for the rapid fire round, which is something I asked every guest, and that is, what is your wish for Singapore football?
Just that I think probably two things, but one is that, Singaporean fans are able to have a domestic league and domestic clubs and a production line of young talent that they can be proud of, that brings out the best in Singaporean character and sport. And I've seen the level of talent there, for a relatively small population. It's extraordinary. You should be very proud of it. But of course, your domestic competition has been up and down over a very long period of time.
Yeah.
The commercial issues around it, have never quite been solved. And, you were in Malaysia for some time and then Singapore. And, there's been this,
back and forth.
Constant attempts to get the best out of it. And it's not an easy puzzle to solve because you need regional support and so on. But I simply wish that, Singapore football is able to reach its wonderful potential, of both the people, the passion, and the talent that I know that you've always had.
Craig, it's been wonderful talking to you. I think Raushan hit the nail on its head early on when he said that you spent 1 year in Singapore football, but I think it's our great honor that you played in Singapore, because what you've gone on to achieve in your life and off the pitch, I think it's a great testament to the person that you are, the qualities that you have, and the upbringing that you come from. We are really proud to have you on the show today to talk about the different values and what football can do to support global citizens, I would say. Thank you so much, Craig.
Thank you, and the pleasure's all mine.
Thank you so much, Craig. All the power to you.